So I want to keep this direct and to the point and get as much wisdom as we can to the audience. There's two areas I wanted to kind of focus on. One is around sales strategy, more of the tactical as well as the strategic. And we'll get into that with each of our panelists. But the second area is really around personal orientation as a CEO or founder or the first VP of sales, how you should kind of think about approaching this, especially since a lot of us have technology backgrounds. We're probably in deep tech companies. Our center of gravity is probably more towards the technology side, and we have to kind of build some new muscles and new orientation around the sales motion. So these are two areas I'd like to focus on. But let's first start with sales strategy. So, if you're a founder or a CEO of a pre-Series A or newly Series A company, and you're starting to see that, okay, you got to think a little bit more than just looking at your network to generate your sales, and like you said, Ashmeet, get your feet dirty and get out there more. What are some strategies that you've seen work? What are some things that you see that didn't work? And please be specific in giving some more texture to each of those. Anybody can start. Anybody want to start? Otherwise, I'll pick somebody. Susan, please go ahead.
I can start. So we're strong devotees of the Crossing the Chasm. We like vertical markets where a company can go in, provide the total solution, own the customer base within that segment, because we find that customers within that segment are more referenceable to each other. So an oil and gas customer using a product or a service wants to hear from another oil and gas as opposed to a grocery store. And our focus is really on reducing sales cycle, getting to cash as quickly as you can, and owning that segment. We find that if you can reduce the attack surface area from your competitors coming in by owning that segment, oftentimes a competitor coming in is going to acquire you before they're going to compete with you. So we are really looking at very focused approaches to companies. So just as an example, company from our standpoint is we like the fintech space quite a bit. We invested in a company called Omni. This was the 6th company for this team. I'd backed them twice before, where they built and exited. Their focus was the faster movement of cash across the backbone for banks and fintech customers. And this is very typical for us. We like kind of messy, gnarly back-end areas. For them, they identified an initial market opportunity, which was the faster movement of debit payments across the cash backbone area. Once they accomplished owning that segment across the top 10 banks around the United States, then they moved into the next segment, the next beachhead, which was real-time payments. And we had the company acquired within 30 months by MasterCard. That team has done the successful integration of the startup and MasterCard. They've come back out, and we've done and funded another fintech company for them that they're scaling very quickly. So we like that very focused, identify within a segment before you move to the other, as opposed to trying going across very very horizontal.
Maybe just a follow-up question or a question to this. So the topic is not about acquisition per se, but was MasterCard already a customer?
MasterCard was a partner, as was Visa, as was American Express.
Okay, and so how did that conversation go where MasterCard start to show interest in maybe taking this more in-house and off the...
It's true for all of our companies. When you have, I think somebody here talked about big friends and big partners. Usually your acquirers that come to talk to you about that know the company, they know the culture. They don't like to take undue risks, so you're oftentimes a channel partner with them. And so that's a pretty easy conversation once you become a strategic value to them.
Okay, thank you. Bob, Ashmeet, who wants to go next?
Go ahead.
Sure, I was going to give an example. When it comes to sales strategy, startup by definition is weak. It is small, it has few resources, and you are working in a marketplace where there are incumbents, larger companies, etc., who you have to compete with. And so whatever move you may make, and there are many moves you can make, have some element of judo in them. In other words, you are going to have some asymmetric force working for you. Here's an example that we used at VMware in the early days. So VMware is a very small company, primarily selling over the internet in the test and dev market. I'm running ESX server, and we want to launch into a market where the two incumbents are effectively Microsoft and Intel, both, by the way, at this point having been sued for antitrust. That's how powerful they are. And we're going to sit in the middle between Intel and Microsoft and try and sell this product called ESX Server. That product, by the way, is now doing, depending on how you count it, it and its children is doing order of $10 billion, $9 billion in revenues. So what did we do? We decided to partner with very large players who were weak in that market. Who were the weak players? The server vendors, HP, IBM, Dell, Fujitsu, Siemens, NEC. The 5 largest server vendors were in themselves very large, strong companies, but very weak in terms of the power structure that they had in the server market. By partnering with them, we were able to insert ourselves into the market. So our go-to-market was very simple. The only orders we took came on a purchase order to IBM or Fujitsu, Siemens or NEC or Dell or HP. But of course, what was on that purchase order was a sell-through to us. We did all the hard work of selling. The shoe leather work that I was talking about, the lead gen, the market education, nobody knew what virtualization was. Nobody knew what ESX Server was. We had to do all of that work, but the orders came through our friends, HP, IBM, Dell, etc. So that's a technique that a startup can use to enter into a market. There are other techniques, but they all have elements of judo.
So that particular example, Ashmeet, this is a classic challenge that you'll see in a lot of earlier stage, is the discipline to say no. If something comes your way, it's an attractive opportunity from just an economic perspective, but it's not ideal because it doesn't fit into your strategy. And it's not ideal because maybe it has a lot of services revenue rather than actual product revenue. Maybe talk a little bit about how to build that discipline, and just maybe some a little bit more context around how to be more disciplined about it.
The discipline to say no is an essential ingredient for every function in a startup. In fact, and it isn't one of the hardest things to do for an executive. Steve Jobs always said, it's not difficult to figure out what to put in the product. What's difficult is what to throw out of the product. He was a great product guy. I'm a product person. Very hard to make the cut list of what you're going to throw out. Same thing in sales. You can spend all your time on this giant funnel. Doesn't matter. You have to work on the deals which are actually going to close that quarter. That's the discipline to say no over there. So you have to apply this to all of those. In terms of channel, yes, channel conflict is a huge issue. Any company which succeeds in a channel model must find effective ways to avoid channel conflict. At VMware, our rule was very simple. We just didn't take orders. If you wanted to give us an order, you had to come through a partner. So we would actually literally walk a purchase order into our partners and say, here's an order for you. And that's how we started selling.
Bob, before we jump to you, just to follow up on this, I'm curious about this. So when you see a founder who is maniacally focused and very disciplined, and each of you invest either as a fund or individually or both, do you want to see any wiggle room in that? I mean, is it more attractive to have somebody who's just extremely focused? Because the downside is you can run out of runway. I mean, how much of this navigation do you want to be able to see? How much pivoting do you want to allow, micro pivoting, right, versus the big strategic pivoting? If you can kind of speak to that. I'll give it to each of you.
Yeah, so what I've found, and having been part of 3 startups, is that you have to cast a slightly wider net than you think you do. And what I mean by that is everybody sort of, when you start a company, you've obviously got a vision and a passion for whatever your bullseye is, because that's why you left your other job to go do this, because you care and you're passionate about it and you go do that. The thing I've seen sort of blow up in entrepreneurs' faces is when they get so overly dogmatic about focusing on that bullseye. And there's sort of these memes about, we must be 100% ruthlessly focused on our bullseye and put all our wood behind that arrow. What if you're wrong? And often, the real urgency or the problem or opportunity is a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, a little bit up, a little bit down. So, for instance, at MobileIron, when we first started, we were like, all right, we sell security and management for Symbian and BlackBerry, right? And that was where the numbers said we should go. Well, this little thing called an iPhone showed up in 2008. It was a toy in the enterprise. Nobody was using it. Everybody's like, that's never going to show up at work. And like, if we had just done market analysis and stayed ruthlessly focused on what we thought our initial goal was, we would have died. So cast a slightly wider net. And interestingly, the caution and how it feels like is often it feels like heresy. You'll feel like you're betraying your founding idea, and you'll have sort of big fights internally about, should we go work on this thing that's a little bit to the left that might have more heat and more opportunity to it? If you end up in that situation, it's totally normal. Find the urgency. That's the most important thing.
Susan, anything to add?
I guess I would concur with finding the urgency factor. What we tend to find is that early on, companies will go through this searching mechanism, but once you lock and load on a particular aspect where you're getting traction and you're starting to see the sales cycle time starting to drop, and you have repeatable messages and you're starting to scale within that segment, then we go very much focused on that and
Yeah,
go
right.
very quickly on that.
point.
But early on, it's not unusual to do a little bit of movement, but we don't generally see that in our companies as they start to scale out. Because I think one of the challenges you can get, and classic outlier venture model is not atypical for this, is you'll have a horizontal product, you'll be competing on many different segments, and the challenge with that is you invite competition across a large attack surface area. For us, we like the more focused area where you go methodically one-to-one, because then you own that segment and you own the next segment, and we just find that that's a much more robust way from a competitive standpoint, because you always have to assume that everybody else is more well-funded than you and has greater capability than you. So how do you compete as a small startup? You've got flexibility, you have the ability from your domain knowledge, and you have speed as your capabilities, of your inherent characteristics. And so you have to utilize those to be able to compete with these large behemoths that will ultimately come into the segment.
Great thoughts. Ashmeet, any closing thoughts on this one?
Let me build on that. I mean, completely agree with the comments both that Bob and Susan have made. The real success for startups often comes in adjacent markets. You must be listening carefully. You have to be flexible, agile, speed. But the way I'll frame those for you to think about is, what are the advantages that a startup has over a big company? I talked earlier about the weaknesses of a startup. One of the unfair advantage that a startup has, in addition to speed, agility, etc., is that you can take risk. You can take disproportionate risk as a startup that a big company cannot. Here's an example. When we launched ESX Server at VMware, we said we will support Oracle. Oracle runs the most important production workloads in enterprises, the things that people are most risk averse for. Oracle took years to launch support for us. We said we'll take all the risk. What did we have to lose? We were just a little startup. We were 20 people sitting around a table thinking what to do over here, and we were saying we will support this product for you. So we took on this asymmetric risk which nobody else could take. Only a startup could have taken. No large company could have taken that. HP couldn't do it, IBM couldn't do it, Dell couldn't do it. No one else could have gone out and said, we're going to go support Oracle in your production environment on this, totally untested technology called virtualization. So thinking about an unfair advantage is the way you can win as a startup.
Great, good thoughts. So, Susan, you talked about this point that I'm going to throw over to Bob. And Bob, you teased it with the repeatability point. So let's get back to the last point on strategy, and then we'll move over to the human side. But Bob, can you expand on that or talk about the strategy side?
Yeah, so for context, my background is I'm mostly a product person with a little bit of go-to-market experience. And, the biggest aha for me in building a company, in figuring out the go-to-market, was learning that I thought about it wrong. So, there are a lot of companies that get to product market fit. You as sort of the founders, you sort of ham and egg your way to like 15, 20 customers, you find product market fit, they give you money. But growth never happens, and you're really frustrated as to why that doesn't happen. There's like this missing link between product market fit and growth that nobody really talks about, which drives me nuts. So, I call that go-to-market fit, which is how can you find and win customers over and over and over and over again? How do you find and win customers over and over and over again? And interestingly, as a founder, you can't do it, because founder selling is inherently unrepeatable. Founders have like magic pixie dust. You can get meetings that regular salespeople can't. You can say things in meetings regular salespeople can't. You can commit to things that regular salespeople can't. It's totally not repeatable. So finding, founder-led selling to validate your idea and convincing customers can give you money, that's really important, but it's not enough to unlock growth. You have to find repeatability. And interestingly, what I learned the hard way was that I thought about repeatability meant I just really needed a good PowerPoint pitch to go sell stuff. So that's not what it's about. It's about how do you find customers, who are you selling to, what's the urgency that gets them to talk to you, what do you do in the first meeting, what do you do in the second meeting, what do you do in an eval, how do you get them to close, there's all these things you have to do to build like a repeatable go-to-market playbook. So that's the thing that for me about repeatability ended up being key was how do you build that repeatable go-to-market playbook for how you find and win customers, and you iterate on that the same way you iterate on product. And you need like a couple normal salespeople to help you figure that out because you can't find that by yourself. And the magic is when you find that distilled repeatable playbook, you can usually nail it into like one slide. If you can't distill it all the way down to one slide, like it's not repeatable yet. Because imagine your salesperson is going to put it on the back of their cue ball and be like, this is what I do to win deals, right? And this relates to the taking on Goliaths, because if you haven't found your own repeatability, you can't beat the Goliaths. You just can't. You've got to find your go-to-market repeatability. So that's magic for you to unlock growth and take on Goliaths. But there's another part of it that's really key, which is if you have found repeatability, you can teach other people repeatability, which gets to my find big friends comment. Like whether it's ESX teaming up with servers, or at Airspace, we did big OEM deals with Alcatel, Nortel, and NEC. Like we took on Cisco in one of their core markets, Wi-Fi, when they had like 80% market share and everybody thought we were nuts. So what did we do? We basically said, all right, who hates Cisco? It was like Alcatel, NEC, Nortel, they all hated Cisco. We're like, all right, let's go be friends with those guys. And if we hadn't figured out our own repeatability, we could have done some nice Barney deal with those guys, but unless we could teach them how to find and win deals, it wasn't actually going to help. So those are the two key things about taking on Goliath. One is find your own repeatability on go-to-market, and the second one is then you can teach it to big friends to take on the Goliaths.
I think if I could follow on one item on Bob, the type of individuals, salespeople that you will have early on will most likely be different than the ones as you start to scale up, because the early ones are folks that have a natural curiosity and a bent for figuring things out.
Yeah, they're like Davy Crockett, sort of find the
They are
path. Yeah.
the early guys,
Yeah.
and they don't do well with process later on, but they love the early stage. And so there will come a point once you start to begin to lock down on that messaging and the sales process and the sales book, then you will start to think about, okay, these folks are not going to scale for me. Now I need to bring in more of I don't want to call them total coin op, but these are the folks that take the playbook and execute to the playbook. They will not be the ones who think through the issues that you're dealing with to sort and figure it out. They are the ones that will execute on the sales book. So you must make sure that when you're ready for that transition, don't do it too early, because these folks will burn a lot of cash because you'll start to put kind of the pedal to the metal. And if you kind of misfire on that too early, you'll have burned a lot of cash. You're, almost wasting it. So there is a phase that'll start to happen, and you'll see that in the sales cycle process, and you'll start to see that as the pipeline builds out and kind of the appetite of the customers start to build up.
Yeah, this point Susan's making is critical. That one of the mistakes that startups often make, if it's like, okay, I got to go figure out this sales stuff and go-to-market stuff, your boards will say, go hire a VP of sales. Like, that's the exact wrong thing to do. Like, no grade A VP of sales will be the first salesperson in the building. And they're not going to be the right person. You need the early Renaissance sales reps, you need the Davy Crockett's that sort of help find the path through the woods, and then once you find that, then you go hire VP of sales, and then you scale up the organization. So the point Susan's making is exactly right.
Yeah, and I would say before you even get to the VP of sales, when you're making that transition, is really go through the director of sales first to make sure you got it right. Because remember, again, When you start to scale sales, you are at the highest burn point on your company. And so those dollars count, and not misfiring that will save you a lot of money as you start to scale up.
So let's go to the second point, which I think we're already bleeding into, which is the human side of this. You know, many of the folks in the audience, I grew up on the technology side as well. There's blind spots that you might see in your portfolio founders and CEOs, and you guys have maybe gone through this evolution as well. Any awareness tips or any, shine a light on blind spots or anything you can kind of talk to for a technical founder that is looking to get their first sales? Like, what's the advice you'd give?
So, there are a couple of key areas on that. First, sales is really understanding the messaging. But where I find founders oftentimes will misstep is that sometimes they'll just hand over sales to these experienced folks and not run tight close to that process. Because what'll happen is your sales guys are great at selling, and they're selling you. And so you have to stay very close to the customers, because what you see in the pipeline and what are the promises, you need to understand that very quickly. Because if things are not happening the way they should be happening, then the earlier you can address that, the better off than waiting 2 quarters, 3 quarters, and you're like, wait a minute, how many did we I thought we were going to close these sales. And it's like, wait a minute, you just said they were a quarter delayed. So you really need to stay very close to that sales process.
Ashmeet?
I wanted to talk about this notion of blind spots and say that one of the biggest blind spots is believing the story of your competition. When I talk to companies, especially when I talk to entrepreneurs in earlier stages, they will often believe exactly what is being said, especially by the large companies, because they have a big horn and they're going to toot a lot of messages out there. And a great example of someone not doing this is just from a few days ago when we saw this announcement from Google. So Google, of course, is not the incumbent in the cloud market. Amazon is the leader there. Microsoft, a close second in terms of how they are approaching it. What does Google do? Remember, they're a distant third, right? So now they're trying to get sales traction in a market where they're competing against much larger companies. They announced that they will pay open source vendors to run on their platform. They will share their profits for open source vendors running on their platform. What a brilliant move. Now every single open source developer is their friend. Every single open source developer out there wants you to run on Google and not on Amazon or Microsoft. Someone who didn't care earlier where you ran now has a preference. So these are the techniques that you have to use as you plan your go-to-market, and then execute it with exactly the techniques that Bob and Susan are talking about in terms of who the salesperson is, how they get the message out there, being capital efficient. I'm a huge fan of capital efficiency. It is a red flag when you are burning a lot on sales. That means you have scaled prematurely. You should be able to, your sales force should be returning capital to you. That's why they're your sales force. That's what they're out there to do. I can see the sign for time out there, so this is a rich topic. We can keep going on it. But think about it both from the strategy and the tactics when you build your sales.
So 2 minutes left. Bob, take us home on this.
Yeah, so, man, as a first-time CEO, going from like 3 people to 1,000, I had all sorts of blind spots. And new blind spots discovered all the time. And it took a little while to sort of figure out what the pattern was behind it. But I'll tell you sort of the meta point and then give you a couple examples. So the meta point is that almost all the big mistakes I made were because as the company was changing, I wasn't changing. That like the things that actually make you successful in your companies, like 0 to 50 people, are the things that screw you up when you're going from 50 to 150, and then the things that help you do that are the things that screw you up when you go from 450 to 1,000. And there's an irony to it, because the things that actually help you be successful often hold you back or kill you later. And so you ironically have to unlearn, which is a very counterintuitive thing to do. So in the very beginning, I was a very sort of product-centric CEO, sort of like, like Captain America or Wonder Woman in the woods with a platoon, throwing punches, getting punched, digging ditches, like it's great fun. But then you have to go to be more like the Avengers, where it's like you and the band of superheroes, and you have to go hire a bunch of superheroes that all have better superpowers than you, a sales superhero, a marketing superhero. And I had to let go, which is hard. And the other thing is when you hire grade A executive superheroes, guess what the first thing they do? They talk about all the stuff you've been working on and how crappy it is. They're like, ugh. So they call your baby ugly. And it's uncomfortable. And that's kind of the point. And so there's all these little like unlearnings that have to happen all the time. And I think, those were my blind spots, is sort of figuring out, oh wait, this is something that made me successful before. It became sort of habit and I was proud of it and it's sort of like what I thought I was good at. And then I realized I had to stop doing those things, which generates a lot of insecurity. It's hard and kind of counterintuitive, but it's really important.
So let's end with that. Learn, unlearn, relearn. Remember that. That's the evolution of an entrepreneur. All right, thanks to the panel.
Thanks,
you guys
everyone.
for taking time
Thank you,
out.
everyone.
Thanks to everybody here as well.
This is
Thank you.
great.